like a what if. So what if we were going to pull out of the UN? And what if we were going to say you can't be in New York anymore, right? And then Beijing comes in and says, we got a building for you, okay, beautiful building, okay, you can come here. And now the UN is in Beijing. And all the countries around the world now don't come to New York anymore, they go to Beijing.
Booting the United Nations from New York City, slashing a quarter of their entire funding, surrendering this premier global stage straight to Beijing. This wasn't a warning from a fringe commentator. It was delivered directly at a congressional hearing by Representative Jared Moskowitz, without any sugarcoating. We are watching the precise instant the United States wakes up to being manipulated by the exact entity it bankrolls. Endless billions in U.S. taxpayer money are flowing into a UN that gladly ignores Iran and dismisses terror sanctions, yet constantly preaches to America about self-defense. Stick around until the very end, because when Moskowitz presses the panel about China potentially hijacking the UN, the resulting admission completely dismantles the greatest myth held by the DC elite. Make sure to subscribe, because you deserve to witness the undeniable proof of how American wealth is being drained right in our own backyard.
I ask unanimous consent that my letter of September 23, 2025, calling on the Secretary General to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization be placed in the record. And additionally, his response more than a month later, talking about the need for peace and a permanent ceasefire, but not responsive to my letter.
Let's look at the first piece of evidence. Pure deflection. Moskowitz kicks things off by holding up undeniable written proof, a letter addressed straight to the UN Secretary General, urging them to officially label Hamas a terrorist group. It was an unambiguous, straightforward demand following recent atrocities. The response? More than 4 weeks of absolute silence, followed by a cookie-cutter reply preaching about peace and ceasefires. They completely dodged the primary subject. The UN preaches about global harmony, yet they lack the courage to identify the actual threat to it. What's worse, this deliberate dodging doesn't come cheap. It is bankrolled by our tax dollars. Watch as Moskowitz grills witness Gannarini about where the money is really going.
Mr. Gannarini, did I say that right? Yes. Okay. I saw your graph, right? I would be interested to see the graph and overlaying that with the U.S. budget. Obviously the spending at the UN goes up, but I'm just also curious if that's just not an outlier, that our spending has gone up in the U.S. budget in the same way, and if that's just caught up in it. I'm just curious if you've looked at that.
Yeah, U.S. funding for the UN has increased in more or less at the same rate as from other donors to the UN system. In fact, it's generally fairly coordinated, voluntary contributions in terms of how member states sort of divvy up their spheres of influence at the UN.
Okay.
Divvy up their spheres of influence. Pay close attention to that phrase. Nations are leveraging their voluntary donations to purchase leverage within the UN walls. American financial contributions are skyrocketing. The charts are trending upward, but is our global sway actually reflecting that massive investment, or are we simply tossing billions into an endless void, allowing global bureaucrats to push narratives that directly contradict American priorities? This staggering disconnect is blindingly obvious when you look at the UN's treatment of Iran. How exactly does a regime infamous for human rights abuses and funding terror secure a position on a committee focused on disarmament? Moskowitz aims directly at Mr. Yao to demand an answer. What follows is an absolute masterclass in hiding behind artificial neutrality.
Mr. Yao, you mentioned, obviously, that no one from the UN appointed Iran to that, and then it was donor states. But did anyone from the UN come out and criticize their appointment? I'm just curious.
The job of UN officials is to work with all 193 member states.
But nobody has like an opinion?
They may have opinions. Their job is to make sure that these convenings of global states to discuss important non-proliferation matters.
The job of UN officials is to work with all 193 member states. Let's analyze this carefully. This is the ultimate cover-up for administrative cowardice whenever a ridiculous choice gets greenlit, such as granting Iran power on a weapons board. The UN leadership conveniently morphs into passive, rule-following bureaucrats. They insist it's not their place to step in. They claim they are forbidden from expressing opinions and portraying themselves as impartial diplomats who never cast judgment. But does that reflect reality? Does the UN truly stay silent and refrain from weighing in on controversial issues? Moskowitz refuses to let Mr. Yehu slide with such a flimsy justification. He instantly fires back, laying bare the blatant hypocrisy of the UN's highest office.
I mean, the secretary seems to have a lot of opinions about what happens in the Middle East.
Right.
He's commented on that a lot of times, but
Indeed,
you know,
he has
between
repeated,
the Israel and Hamas war. But
Yeah, I agree. He's repeatedly, as you know, denounced the Hamas attacks on Israel, repeatedly met with the families of the hostages when they're
I mean, it's
still
not really a hard
hostages.
statement. Like, you know, he could come out and say, you know, look, obviously it wasn't his pick, but, you know, maybe they're not like the best country to be on that panel.
I hear
know?
you.
There's the brutal reality, fully exposed. Moskowitz completely shatters their illusion of neutrality. Out of nowhere, the UN Secretary-General is full of opinions when there are political points to be won regarding the Middle East conflict. He is eager to issue condemnations, show up at press conferences, and take a very public stand. But when Iran is handed a seat on a critical committee, crickets. They lack the spine to offer even the softest diplomatic pushback, such as, while we respect the voting mechanisms, maybe this specific regime isn't the ideal fit. Instead, they opt for complete silence, and this is the explosive core of the entire hearing. Once you recognize that an institution running on your billions is actively weaponizing double standards against your nation, how do you respond? Do you continue burning cash in hopes of a miracle, or do you violently upend the status quo? Representative Moskowitz chooses to upend it. He pivots to witness Kontorovich to pose Washington's most forbidden hypothetical. What if America simply packs up and leaves?
I want to do just because I am curious about this. Is it Mr. Kantorovich? Yeah. Okay. So, because I'm curious about this, I want to just run like a what if. So what if we were going to pull out of the UN? And what if we were going to say you can't be in New York anymore? Right? And then Beijing comes in and says, we got a building for you. Okay. Beautiful building. Okay. You can come here. And now the UN is in Beijing.
It's a hypothetical question, yet it represents the absolute worst-case scenario for American politicians. For generations, the only logic keeping the U.S. chained to the UN has been pure anxiety. If we abandon ship, China will immediately step in. The DC elite constantly caution that we would be surrendering the global order to the CCP. They conjure images of a UN operating out of Beijing, fueled by Chinese wealth, dictating global policy on their terms. Moskowitz cuts straight to the chase. What if we actually exit? What if we abandon the strategy of using funding as a reform tool and just walk out the door? And Kantorovich's response is far more than a simple reply. It is a brilliant lesson in calculating true leverage on the global stage.
And all the countries around the world now don't come to New York anymore. They go to Beijing. And, you know, they're funding 70% of the UN. Because I think there's bipartisan agreement that there are major issues. I think where there's some disagreement is, you know, do you use the budget to try to reform it, right? Do you use the threat of support to try to reform it, or do you leave? And the do you leave situation for me, I just don't see how that gets better. So I just want to discuss
Could I address the hypothetical?
Yeah, please.
So I don't think leaving is is within the political horizon, which
Okay.
is why I don't address it. But I think it is worth looking at what would happen, because you know the argument, but China's going to take over, or China will sort of eat our cake if we pull back, is one of the major arguments against U.S. pullback at the United Nations. But I think it's worth saying that the United Nations without the United States is not the same United Nations. It is not the same prize for China to take over.
It is not the same prize. Pause and process the massive implications of that single statement. It thoroughly destroys the hostage mentality that has paralyzed Washington for years. We've been conditioned to view the UN as a naturally supreme force, believing we have to grip onto it tightly to preserve our own influence. However, Kantorovich flips the script entirely. The UN's authority isn't derived from a skyscraper in Manhattan, a fancy podium, or the collective of 193 nations. Its relevance, its heavy influence, and its claim as the global consensus rely almost entirely on the backing of the United States of America. Should America freeze its 25% funding and walk out the door, China wouldn't be inheriting the formidable United Nations of today. They would merely be adopting a hollow shell, a powerless talking shop, stripped of its primary budget, and stripped of its supreme credibility.
With the United States in, it makes sense for China to try to assert influence because it has vastly more credibility. Without the United Nations, not just in budgetary terms, 25%, right? It's in theory, a fundamentally different organization. I don't think anyone wants to be in Beijing as much as they want to be in New York, and parking would certainly be much better.
Beijing aggressively covets the UN specifically because America is sitting at the table. They intend to hijack a platform legitimized by U.S. standing to project their own dominance. But what happens if the main attraction takes its reputation and its checkbook and goes home? No one is going to travel halfway across the globe to Beijing just to participate in a severely downgraded forum. Kantorovich's quip that the parking would certainly be much better is a sharply sarcastic jab at how unappealing a US-free UN would actually be. Yet, the absolute peak of this testimony comes in the very next thought. It zeroes in on the most toxic illness plaguing Western diplomacy today, the too big to fail illusion.
So I wouldn't catastrophize it. There would be definitely drawbacks, but what I think is catastrophic is ruling that out as an option from the beginning, because it makes it a too big to fail lock-in situation.
Well, that's actually a great point, right? Is the UN too big to fail, right? I mean, that's a good question, which, you know, I understand maybe from a negotiation standpoint, you don't want to take any option off the table. I'm fine with that.
What I think is catastrophic is ruling that out as an option from the beginning. Ever ask yourself how the UN feels bold enough to blatantly ignore a US congressman's letter demanding action against Hamas, or how they remain perfectly calm while Iran slips onto a critical committee? It is simply because they do not fear us. They are entirely aware that the political class in DC will never actually pull the plug. Moskowitz sees right through this game. He isn't explicitly demanding we shut down the UN tomorrow. Rather, he is fighting to reclaim the ultimate authority of any negotiation. America must be willing to put the walk-away card on the table. The UN will only learn to play by the rules when they face the genuine threat of losing 25% of their financial lifeblood. True reform is the endgame here. However, you cannot fix a bloated bureaucratic machine by pleading or sending letters that gather dust for a month. You force change by drawing a hard red line. The current power dynamic at the UN is a breeding ground for hypocrisy, where they freely use the wealth of the world's greatest democracy to appease oppressive regimes. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Should the United States wield the threat of a total withdrawal to squeeze actual reforms out of the UN? Do you agree with the premise that handing the UN over to China leaves them with a worthless trophy if America isn't involved?